The author of Hebrews writes to the church body, "Let us not forsake our assembly."
And his name is Jesus!
And on Sunday morning, a lot of us will gather in a big room like this. You know the drill.
Jacksonville, Florida is truly a city of many blessings. People from all over Northeast Florida drive in to be a part of this exciting fellowship.
Father, thank you tonight, Lord God, for all.
Great job, ladies.
To Isaiah 61. Wow! Is that a story of God?
Thank you, Brother Doug, for that.
Although we've gotten pretty used to this template, for the author of Hebrews and for the first several hundred years of Christianity, the assembly would have referred to a very different type of event. So even though we've sung a lot of songs together and heard a lot of prayers and listened to a lot of 30-minute sermons sitting right alongside each other, there's a good chance that we've completely forgotten about the assembly. Today when we meet for church, we almost always meet in an auditorium. That's rows of seats that are all facing a stage. And although the ancient Greco-Roman world did have auditoriums, they were usually reserved for the theater. So for the first 300 years of Christianity, churches met in a completely different venue. It was the private home. We're talking the home of Lydia in Philippi, the home of Theophilus in Antioch. And from archaeological data, we know that these houses didn't have auditoriums. Instead, the rooms that these churches were usually gathering in were tricliniums. That's the Greek dining room.
The shape of the room lends itself to what we call a triclinium. It is an architectural form, a three-sided table, where the guests are on the outer side and the servants can come up the middle.
So it's important to talk about how this isn't just a difference in furniture, like the classic pews versus chairs debate. Instead, this signifies a pretty substantial difference in function, because an auditorium is built to highlight things that are happening on a stage, but a triclinium is set up to host a very different type of event. As pretty much a rule, every gathering of the early Christian church featured a communal meal. That's because in the Greco-Roman world, the banquet was probably the most important social institution, and so it was the format that every voluntary association used for their periodic gatherings, which included the Christian church. And the banquet format had two important parts. It was a supper, followed by a symposium. Paul actually writes about the supper portion in 1 Corinthians 10 and 11. So then, my brothers and sisters, when you gather to eat, you should all eat together. When we think about the Lord's Supper, we usually think about a cracker and some juice that we might have at the end of church sometimes. But in Paul's day, the Lord's Supper was actually a full meal. It was an important time together. Nowadays, we kind of have the sense that communion represents unity with Christ because we're uniting with the cracker that we're eating. Now I'm one with the cracker. But it's also unity with the body, like look around at everyone else and what they're doing. It's kind of really unusual that we call it communion, but we've almost turned it into this completely private me and Jesus time where I'm analyzing and introspecting every aspect of my relationship with him. There's a lot of people with eyes closed or looking at the floor, when for 300 years, the Lord's Supper was a social event. And here's how that stopped. When Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the empire in 314 AD, it unlocked a lot of state funds to be used for the construction of new places of worship. And those new buildings, which were called basilicas, didn't have the space for serving and enjoying food, and so began the long history of turning the Lord's Supper into like a cafeteria-line serving of a cracker with no one really engaged in communion or edifying conversation or fellowship. As for the second part of the banquet, I would encourage you to look into the symposium, because although it did include a lot of the same features that we might associate with the modern worship service, like music and reading the Bible, there wasn't any set order in which everything had to be performed. We have 2nd century historians like Tertullian who write about how the musicians would wander around the triclinium ministering to different people, and although sometimes all eyes might be on one person speaking, maybe like a visiting apostle who was there to teach, for the most part there was usually little clusters of Christians who were exhorting each other or reading letters or arguing about what the visiting apostle just talked about. All of these are activities that are pretty hard to do in an auditorium or really any room that has a stage. Flash forward to 2021, and some pastors are willing to go to jail to defend their right to have huge worship services in an auditorium, despite the federal COVID regulations against large gatherings. Why? The church got along just fine in private homes for 300 years, and the church still gets along just fine in private homes in many places around the globe. Maybe we're actually missing out on something. In the Gospel of John, Jesus meets the woman at the well and lets her know some really good news. In the future, it won't matter where you worship. The important thing will be that you worship in spirit and in truth. So, although I'd like to think we could worship God just as well in a room that looks like this, or this, or this, on the tail end of this pandemic shutdown, I don't know that I could ever go back to a church that gathers in an auditorium with a giant stage that highlights the activities of some people over the body of people that have gathered to be together. It just seems like it's set up to do the wrong things. And when we find ourselves sitting in these long passive rows watching the clergy perform, it's probably a good time to think about Jesus' words to the woman at the well and question why we're doing what we're doing. What are the intentions of our spirit? And what's the source of our truth?